Okay, so this is embarrassing. Recently, I got home from a shoot and I put my photos onto the computer and I noticed they weren't as sharp as I would want them. And so I thought, you know what? This would be a good time for me to make a video. And at the end of the video, I'm going to show you what to do if you do all of these things and you still don't end up with photos that are perfectly sharp. This first one might seem completely common sense, and it is, but it is also the most common reason that photographers end up with photos that aren't quite as sharp as they want, and that is that they weren't paying attention. Before you start taking a bunch of photos, ideally on your first few, zoom in, check the eyes, check the part of the landscape that's important, and just make sure that whatever you're doing is working. Because usually if it's working for the first few, it's going to keep working. But if it's not working, then it might be one of these next 7 things. And number 2 is pretty simple, and that's a dirty lens. I shoot a lot at the beach, and there's, water splashing up. There's just, heavy air, salty sea air coming in. All these little things can affect the sharpness of your image. And often you don't notice it when you're taking the pictures because it doesn't always show up as a big blotch in front of the lens. If your lens is dirty, you're often not going to notice it until you're looking at the picture big on your screen that it's just a little not quite sharp. I don't know how else to explain that, but I think that's probably the best way. So make sure you clean your lens before every shoot or after every shoot, however you want to do it. But keeping your lenses clean is, one, good for the lens health and longevity, but also it's going to make sure that your images are as sharp as they can be. Number 3 is that you might be using a lens that just isn't as sharp as you'd like it. And that is kind of the reality of lenses, that the quality of the lens is reflected in the price. A less expensive lens, like for example, this kit lens, I can, shoot this at 85 millimeters, but it's never going to be as sharp as my 85 millimeter prime over here. And that's just the reality of how lenses work. So, if you're using a kit lens or a less expensive lens, then you're just going to have to realize that, razor sharp might not be in the cards for that particular lens. And that is, one of the reasons why I always recommend something like a 50 millimeter prime for anyone getting started, because it's a very affordable way to have a wide aperture, very sharp lens. And the fourth thing we're going to talk about is extreme aperture settings. And I say that because you can lose sharpness on both ends of the extreme. If you have a very wide aperture, a maximum aperture, for instance, my 85 prime there goes as wide as f1.4. In the center, it's pretty sharp at f1.4, but around the edges, of course, it gets less sharp. And if you stop that lens down to say 2.8, it gets extremely sharp. If you're not quite getting the sharpness that you want and you're shooting wide open on one of the on some of these lenses, try stopping it down a stop and you'll get much better results. On the other end of the extreme is something called diffraction. If your image isn't going to be as sharp as if you're shooting right in the middle of that aperture range. If you're shooting at f8, f10, f12 even, you're going to get a much sharper picture than if you shoot at f20. Number 6 is getting the depth of field wrong. And what I mean by this kind of goes with number 5, and that's just not understanding what depth of field means and what the depth of field is for what you're shooting. I use an app called PhotoPills, and it has a depth of field calculator. Anytime I'm shooting more than one person in a photo, I take a quick look at the depth of field calculator and I make sure that I have enough depth of focus, of depth of field, that anyone in that photo will be sharp. Oftentimes, if you're not careful about this, you might accidentally shoot at too wide of an aperture, even if you're shooting a portrait, because you have 2 or 3 people in the photo, and someone who's standing just a little bit behind someone else is going to be a little fuzzy. Number 7 is ISO. When you're shooting at higher ISOs, you're going to get noise, and even if you correct that noise, that shows up as lack of sharpness. Now, you can't always use a low ISO, so sometimes you have to accept the fact that a shot in low light might not be quite as razor sharp as you want it to be. And there's nothing you can do about that if it's a moving subject, especially because You can't use a longer shutter speed and a lower aperture. You just have to deal with it. And that's kind of the give and take in photography. Sometimes you're not going to get the perfect shot, but here's some things you can do to maybe get a little bit more out of your camera. If you can, shoot at a lower ISO and adjust it after the fact. I've seen in most cameras you get better results by increasing the exposure in software like Lightroom than you do by cranking up the ISO on your camera. This may vary from camera to camera, but it's something you can try if you're not getting quite the results you want, or if you're in the moment taking the shot, try both. Try shooting at a lower ISO and just, increasing the exposure later on, and also take another shot at a high ISO. It's always a good idea to take multiple shots using different techniques to see which one works the best. And the last one, number 8, is using the wrong focus mode. And I might surprise you with my take on this, but I almost never use the single shot AF mode. I always leave my camera on either continuous, or if it's one of the newer mirrorless cameras, on eye autofocus. And here's why. What a lot of people say is that for still images like landscapes or still life or something like that, you should switch to single shot AF. That's because the way it works is it'll get focus and it'll stay locked, because the continuous mode would kind of keep hunting for focus, and if it was happened to be hunting for focus while you press the shutter, then you might not get a perfect shot in focus. But here's why I don't use that. If I'm shooting something that isn't moving, and I'm on a tripod, which means the camera and the subject isn't moving, then I will use continuous AF to get initial focus, then go and turn on the live view on the back and use manual mode to dial in the perfect focus. Because both things, the camera and subject, are perfectly still, and I can do that. And that's always going to get you a better result than using the autofocus. And if it's anything else, if you're hand holding or the subject is moving in some way, then continuous autofocus is going to be better than single shot AF. If you use single shot AF on a subject that is even moving slightly, it's going to lock focus and keep focus on wherever it locked and not change if the person moves a little bit back or a little bit forward. And the last tip I promised you, if you do all of these things, you get back home, you open your photos in Lightroom, and they're still not quite in focus, then you're going to want to watch this video so you know what to do next.